There's a moment in every financial crisis when you can feel the ground shifting, when the small tremors become a rumble and the rumble becomes something impossible to ignore. Japan is living in that moment right now, and what happens next won't stay contained within its borders. It will ripple outward, touching economies from Washington to Beijing, affecting decisions that will shape the next decade of global trade, security, and prosperity. The warning signs aren't subtle. They're screaming. Tokyo is preparing to unleash what might be its boldest economic intervention in years, a spending package worth 17 trillion yen, roughly $110 billion. That's an enormous sum for any nation. For Japan, already burdened with one of the world's heaviest debt burdens, it represents a calculated gamble that the financial world watched with genuine alarm. Within days of the announcement, something remarkable happened in the bond markets. Japan's 20-year government bond yield shot upward, hitting levels never seen before in the nation's modern history. When bond traders start running for the exits, it's not a technical adjustment. It's a referendum on whether the system they're funding can actually survive. At the same time, something else is unfolding across the region. Beijing is sending very deliberate signals. The language is careful, but the meaning is unmistakable. Tokyo's recent statements on Taiwan, hints of solidarity, suggestions of deeper ties, have been interpreted in China as a direct challenge, a deliberate poke at something Beijing considers untouchable, and Beijing is signaling that it will respond, not with restraint, but with leverage. It's beginning to sound like the warning before a storm hits. The coincidence of these crises isn't accidental. They're connected by invisible threads that link Japan's economic survival to China's political ambitions, to American trade policy, to interest rates set by central banks, and to decisions made in corporate boardrooms from Tokyo to Silicon Valley. This is the story of how pressures converging from every direction are pushing Japan toward a breaking point. And honestly, what happens in the next 6 months could reshape the global economy in ways we're only beginning to understand. Part 1. The debt spiral. Let's start with what Japan is actually trying to do with this 17 trillion yen stimulus plan. On the surface, the logic makes sense. Households across Japan are struggling. The cost of living has been climbing steadily. Energy prices remain elevated. Wages haven't kept pace. Ordinary people are pinching pennies and cutting back on spending, which means less demand for goods and services, which means businesses stop hiring, which means the entire economic engine starts to sputter. Tokyo's stimulus is designed to reverse that. Direct payments to families, investments in cutting-edge industries, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, green technology. The government's message is clear. We're going to spend our way back to growth. But here's where the market saw a problem. Japan already carries a debt load that would terrify most nations. The ratio of government debt to GDP stands above 230%. That means the government owes more in the form of bonds than the entire country produces in a year, twice over. When you're already this far in debt and you announce plans to borrow even more, the people who actually lend you money, bond investors, pension funds, insurance companies, they have to stop and ask themselves a very uncomfortable question. Will we ever get paid back? For decades, Japanese bond yields stayed artificially low because most of the debt was held domestically. Japanese banks, insurance companies, and ordinary savers bought the bonds. They were comfortable with the arrangement because, honestly, there were few alternatives. Interest rates were near zero. Bonds were seen as a stable, if modest, store of wealth. But that dynamic is shifting. When that 20-year bond yield surged toward 2.8%, something fundamental changed. It was the highest level recorded in Japan's modern era. And it happened because investors are beginning to price in genuine risk. What does a higher bond yield mean in practical terms? It means the government's borrowing costs just jumped up. Every new bond Japan issues will have to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers. Every existing bondholder who watches yields rise watches the market value of their holdings fall, and once that begins, momentum takes over. Traders accelerate their exits, fund managers rebalance, and the upward pressure on yields only intensifies. This creates a vicious cycle. Higher yields force the government to spend more money just servicing its existing debt. That leaves less money for education, infrastructure, defense, or anything else. The only way to cover the gap is to borrow more, which pushes yields even higher. Japan watched this happen to other countries, watched it unfold in Greece, in Italy, in Argentina. Each time, the moment when bond markets lose confidence comes suddenly. One day things seem stable. The next day capital is fleeing and the entire edifice becomes unstable. The timing of this stimulus makes the problem worse. Japan's economy contracted in the third quarter of this year. The GDP fell by 1.8%. That's the first contraction in 6 quarters. It wasn't supposed to happen this quarter. The global environment was supposed to be stabilizing, but it didn't. Instead, the pressure from tariffs, we'll get to that in a moment, combined with weakening export demand and rising import costs to create a negative shock that hit faster than anyone expected. GDP is falling. The government's response is to borrow more. That's not necessarily wrong, but when you're already this indebted, when your bonds are already being scrutinized, when investors are already asking whether your currency can hold its value, the timing couldn't be worse. The yen itself is weakening. When people lose confidence in a government's ability to manage its debt, they lose confidence in its currency. And a weaker yen means imports cost more. Japanese companies have to pay more for foreign raw materials, foreign energy, foreign technology. Those costs get passed along to consumers. Prices rise. The purchasing power of ordinary families falls. And the very problem the stimulus was supposed to solve, households struggling with rising costs, gets worse instead of better. Markets are now caught between two interpretations of what Tokyo is doing. One reading is that the government is desperate, that policymakers know something about the underlying economy that we don't yet see, that they're willing to blow out the debt load because they believe stimulus will boost growth faster than the debt burden grows. The other reading is that Tokyo is trapped, that every option available to policymakers creates problems. Borrow to stimulate, and you risk losing investor confidence in the yen. Don't borrow and let the economy slide deeper into deflation and stagnation. Either choice feels wrong. And when policymakers face a situation where every option feels like it leads to disaster, that's when genuinely destabilizing things can happen. Part 2. The Beijing Challenge. The friction between Tokyo and Beijing has a long history. It's written in textbooks that outline conflicts stretching back over a century. It's embedded in how citizens of each country view each other, in cultural memory, in political rhetoric. Those historical wounds never fully healed. They're scars that still ache, especially when national pride or security gets involved. And right now, something has reopened those scars in a way that threatens to become consequential. Japan has begun making statements about Taiwan. The language is careful, diplomatic, but clear enough to matter. Japan is signaling that it views Taiwan as important to its own security, that Japan sees itself as having a stake in Taiwan's future. From an American perspective, from a Western alliance perspective, this makes perfect sense. Japan is a democratic ally. Taiwan is a democracy under threat. The logic of that alignment is straightforward, but Beijing doesn't see it that way. Beijing sees any Japanese involvement with Taiwan as interference in China's internal affairs. It sees it as a challenge to Chinese sovereignty, and crucially, it sees it through the lens of history, of how Japan occupied Taiwan for 50 years, of how Japan fought China in the 1930s and 1940s, of how these nations have a complicated past that still shapes how they relate to each other today. Consider the tourism sector. It doesn't sound like a strategic vulnerability at first. Tourism is leisure, travel, commerce. It feels peripheral to the core of an economy. But in Japan, tourism accounts for roughly 7% of total GDP. 7% might sound small until you realize what it means in absolute terms. That's hundreds of billions of dollars. It's millions of jobs across hotels, airlines, restaurants, shops, transportation, entertainment. And the backbone of that entire sector is visitors from mainland China. In the first 9 months of this year, 7.5 million tourists came from mainland China alone. That number jumps to 9.3 million if you include visitors from Hong Kong. To put that in perspective, that's more travelers than come from South Korea and the United States combined. Those Chinese tourists don't just visit temples and gardens. They spend money. A lot of it. They shop at department stores. They buy cosmetics. Japan's cosmetics brands are famous throughout Asia. They stay in hotels. They fly on Japanese airlines. They eat at restaurants. They take trains and taxis. That spending flows through the entire economy. So when China's government began warning its citizens about traveling to Japan, vague warnings about tensions, about safety, about whether now was the right time to visit, the impact was immediate and visible. If China decides to freeze travel to Japan, the consequences won't be limited to the tourism sector. They'll ripple outward. A reduction in Chinese tourism weakens retail. When retail weakens, service sector jobs come under pressure. Restaurants laying off staff, hotels reducing hours, shops closing. When service employment falls, consumer spending declines further. That tightens the entire domestic economy. And this is happening at the exact moment when Japan is already struggling with export demand. So you have external pressure from tariffs and trade tensions, and simultaneously, internal pressure from declining consumer activity. These don't operate in isolation. They compound each other. The economy becomes trapped in a feedback loop where one weakness reinforces the others. And here's the thing about Beijing's leverage. It doesn't require China to formally declare retaliation. The threat alone shapes behavior. Japanese companies operating in China become nervous. Japanese retailers become cautious about inventory. Japanese financial markets factor in the risk of disruption. The uncertainty itself becomes economically damaging. You don't need to pull the trigger if everyone around you believes you might. But the leverage China possesses goes far beyond tourism. It runs deeper into the fundamental structure of Japanese industry. And this is where the crisis becomes truly concerning. Japan's stimulus package is fundamentally a bet on technological renewal. The government believes, and there's genuine logic to this belief, that if Japan can reinvigorate its technology sector, if it can compete again in cutting-edge semiconductors and electric vehicles and advanced manufacturing, then it can offset the damage coming from tariffs, from weaker exports, from everything else going wrong. It's a reasonable strategy. The problem is that every single component of this strategy depends on access to materials that Japan doesn't produce. Materials that China controls, almost completely. Let's talk about specifics. Semiconductors are the foundation of the modern economy. Every phone, every computer, every data center, every autonomous vehicle, every AI system runs on chips. Modern advanced chips require gallium and magnesium. These are materials used in creating the semiconductor structures that make these devices work. China produces nearly 100% of the world's gallium, nearly 100% of the magnesium. Japan produces essentially none. When I say nearly 100%, I'm not exaggerating. The global semiconductor industry is completely dependent on Chinese supplies of these materials. If China decides to restrict exports, there's no alternative. Japanese chip makers can't simply turn to Vietnam or Indonesia or India. There's no substitute supplier. The material flows from China or they don't flow at all. That's just the beginning. Rare earth elements are critical for modern electronics. These are elements with names most people have never heard of: neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, erbium. They're used in magnets, sensors, motors, and the sophisticated electronics that go into everything from smartphones to military systems. China doesn't just produce rare earth ore. China dominates the refining process. Turning raw ore into usable refined metals is an extraordinarily complex and environmentally demanding process. China handles the majority of global rare earth refining capacity. Again, when I say majority, I mean roughly 70 to 80% of all global refining happens in China. If China tightens the spigot, the rest of the world simply runs out. And then there's the magnet market itself. Permanent magnets are absolutely essential for electric vehicle motors. They're essential for wind turbines. They're essential for medical imaging devices. They're used across dozens of critical industries. China controls approximately 70% of global permanent magnet production. Japan relies on importing these magnets from China, processing them, and using them in Japanese manufacturing. There's no backdoor supply chain. There's no alternative source that can absorb Japanese demand if Chinese supply is disrupted. Layer on top of this graphite. China supplies the vast majority of the world's natural graphite, especially the refined graphite used in lithium-ion batteries. Want to build electric vehicles? You need graphite. You need Chinese graphite. Japan has none. Must import it. And the list goes on. Tungsten, cobalt, various rare earth oxides. China dominates the supply chains for virtually all of them. This creates an almost impossible strategic situation for Tokyo. The government is announcing plans to revive its technological base right at the moment when it's provoking the one country that controls the mineral supply chains that make technological revival possible. It's like someone announcing they're going to build a house while simultaneously getting into a fight with the person who controls the lumber mill. The timing couldn't be worse. Any disruption, whether China formally imposes export restrictions or whether it happens through informal channels, through a government-directed boycott, through delayed customs clearances, through bureaucratic obstacles, would immediately ripple through Japanese manufacturing. Production costs would rise as companies search for alternative sources and pay premiums to find them. Factory schedules would slip. Supply chain delays would cascade. Japanese companies would struggle to complete orders on time. Customers would look elsewhere. Market share would erode. The very sectors that Tokyo is betting on for long-term revival would face immediate stress. And remember, this is all happening while Japan is already under pressure from tariffs on its exports, while its currency is weakening, while its domestic economy is contracting. Adding supply chain stress on top of all that creates a genuinely dangerous situation. Japan is simultaneously being squeezed from outside through trade restrictions and tariff policies and made vulnerable on the inside through dependence on materials from a country it's currently alienating. Beijing's strategic genius here is that China doesn't even need to weaponize these supply chains overtly. The mere knowledge that China could restrict supply if tensions escalate is enough to create caution in Japanese business planning. Companies become nervous about committing capital to long-term projects. Investors become hesitant about betting on Japanese companies. The uncertainty becomes a drag on economic activity even before any actual restrictions are imposed. While Japan is caught in this strategic bind with China, something equally concerning is happening on the other side of the Pacific. The United States is dealing with its own crisis, and American policies are creating the conditions for that crisis to spread globally. The centerpiece of American economic policy right now is tariffs. The argument for tariffs is familiar to anyone paying attention to politics. Tariffs are supposed to protect American workers. They're supposed to give American companies breathing room to invest and expand. They're supposed to rebuild American manufacturing. The idea is that by making imported goods more expensive, you force American consumers to buy from American producers, which creates demand for American factories, which creates jobs, which strengthens American industry. It sounds logical. In theory, it works. In practice, what's actually happening is something different entirely. Tariffs are making production in the United States dramatically more expensive. Let's look at a concrete example. Aluminum. The world's largest aluminum producer has implemented what they're calling a Midwest premium, a surcharge of $2,000 per ton of aluminum being shipped to the American market. The company explicitly described the American market situation as broken. That language is significant. They're not saying prices are high. They're saying the market is fundamentally dysfunctional. Why? Because stocks are shrinking. Supply is tightening. Prices are exploding across the sector. The tariff regime has created exactly the wrong conditions for industrial development. Think about what this means for actual production. You want to build an electric vehicle in America? You need aluminum for the body. You need copper for the wiring. You need steel for the chassis. Every one of these materials now carries massive tariff premiums. The cost of producing that vehicle inside the United States is now dramatically higher than it would be if production happened elsewhere. So the tariffs, which were supposed to make American production more competitive, have actually made it less competitive. They've made it more expensive to build things in America. Companies are looking at the numbers and realizing that manufacturing domestically is pricing them out of global markets. Steel faces import duties over 30%. Copper faces similar treatment. This pushes prices deeper into territory that's genuinely unsustainable for manufacturers. It's not a minor cost increase. It's a structural problem, and it's forcing producers to make different choices. Canada, which shares a border with the U.S., has begun shifting significant portions of its aluminum exports toward Europe. Why sell into America, where tariffs slash your margins, when you can sell into Europe, where markets remain relatively stable and prices remain rational? The result is that aluminum supply in North America is tightening while European supply remains adequate. American prices have roughly doubled while European prices remain relatively insulated. This damages American competitiveness on the global stage. When American manufacturers have to pay twice as much for raw materials as their European competitors, they're at a structural disadvantage in bidding for international contracts. And this is happening right when America is supposed to be leading the global race for artificial intelligence. That's not hyperbole. Whoever dominates AI will have an enormous advantage in the 21st century economy. And America is trying to establish that dominance. But it requires building massive new industrial capacity, chip fabrication plants, advanced computing centers, data centers, research facilities. Estimates suggest this requires over $1 trillion in new investment. $1 trillion. That's not a small number. That's a transformational investment. And all of these projects depend on materials that are now significantly more expensive because of the tariff regime. American infrastructure is inadequate. The United States has a massive infrastructure funding gap. We're talking about $3.7 trillion of deferred maintenance and necessary upgrades. This includes $580 billion needed for energy systems alone, $690 billion for road maintenance and expansion, $170 billion for bridges. When you're trying to expand manufacturing and build new facilities, you don't just need to buy materials and construct buildings. You need reliable energy grids. You need transportation networks. You need water systems. All of that infrastructure needs to be either built or upgraded, and all of it costs money. This creates a structural problem that's almost like an economic speed limit. Currently, every dollar of industrial output in America requires about $2 of spending. $2 of inputs, materials, labor, energy, infrastructure, to create $1 of output. That's extraordinarily inefficient. It means that expanding industrial production in America is inherently expensive. And the more you try to expand, the more you push against these constraints, the more expensive things become. Higher labor costs, higher energy costs, higher material costs, supply chain delays, transportation bottlenecks. They all push in the same direction, toward higher prices and lower returns on investment. The tariff regime is making all of this worse, not better. By restricting imports of cheap materials, tariffs are pushing the entire cost structure higher. By limiting supply, they're creating bottlenecks. By making investment returns less attractive, they're discouraging the capital flow that actual expansion requires. The result is that America's attempt to rebuild its manufacturing base through tariffs is creating the exact conditions that make manufacturing more difficult and less profitable.